The verses we referred to at the beginning of the chapter that indicate that God wanted organisms to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, we think that those apply to reproduction. But if we look again at them, there are actually multiple Hebrew words that are used here. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. There are three different Hebrew verbs used in that particular passage. In Genesis 8:17, it says to breed abundantly. This is referring to the organisms following the flood. Breed abundantly and be fruitful and multiply. Again, there are three different Hebrew verbs there. In Genesis 9:7, it says be fruitful and multiply and bring forth abundantly and multiply. It's entirely possible that they could all mean the same thing, but the fact that there are three separate Hebrew verbs suggests that there might be different meanings implied in these passages. So in addition to reproduction, I think there's a possibility that what I call diversification actually is included here as well. Not just reproducing in the sense of increasing the number of individuals or creating more individuals, but increasing the number of species in the world, increasing the number of different things in the world. Now, when it comes to this particular topic, we don't know how much of that sort of thing occurred between the creation and the flood. There could have been a lot, there could have been a little. We simply don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us explicitly, and we don't have evidence from that period. But after the flood, we certainly must have had a tremendously large increase in numbers of different species following the flood. Because we're told that only 2 individuals of each created kind, each Brahman, entered the ark if they were an unclean animal, or 7 if they're a clean animal. And what that means is, especially in the case of the unclean animals, we have Brahmans or created kinds that seem to contain hundreds, even thousands of species, but only 2 individuals got onto the ark. So somewhere between the flood and the present, there must have been a tremendous increase in species diversity, the number of different species on the planet. This suggests that intra-Brahmanic diversification occurred following the flood. Intra means within. Brahman or Brahmanic refers to Brahmins, so it's a diversification or increase in species numbers within each created kind. So created kinds are not themselves changing into other created kinds, but within a created kind, species are arising that weren't there before. It's most likely that very specialized species designed for particular environments probably didn't come about until sometime after the flood, that probably the organism representing a created kind brought by God to Noah was in fact a generalized organism, an organism that wasn't specialized for especially environments that you're not going to see in the immediate post-flood world. In fact, the scripture tells us in the book of Job, which we think is one of the oldest books of the Bible, soon after the flood, and in the book of Genesis, referring to, for example, Abraham, not too many centuries after the flood, being given camels and horses and that sort of thing, we have reference to very specialized animals. Lions would be specialized animals in the cat family or the cat created kind. Camels are very specialized animals for the desert in the camel kind. These organisms are mentioned explicitly just a couple centuries or a few centuries after the flood. So since these are specialized animals, it probably means that most of the intra-Brahmanic diversification that occurred following the flood was in fact extremely rapid. Within a few centuries, we've probably restored the full diversity of organisms that God intended from the beginning. This actually makes some sense if, in fact, the diversity is there to show the very nature of God. God doesn't want any one individual to lose that picture or not see that picture. So it would make sense that God would restore the species diversity, the biodiversity, within the space, the lifespan of a single individual. And we're told that Arphaxad, a man born just 2 years after the flood, lived for 400 years. So it makes sense that most likely all the diversification was actually complete by the end of 400 years following the flood. If that is the case, which does seem to be the case, then intrabarometric diversification must have been very, very rapid. It's too rapid to probably have been caused by anything other than God having placed within organisms the ability to diversify, basically a computer program, if you wish, kind of like that, to cause them to increase in the number of species. And he hid information on the organisms inside organisms so that they could quickly diversify following the flood. At this point in time, that's our best guess as to what's going on. This means that the information for intrabarometric diversification was designed by God in the original creation and hidden within organisms to be expressed then following the flood. This is consistent with what we see in many organisms in the present. Breeding has revealed a whole bunch of hidden designs. We've basically bred what probably was something very similar to a wolf into a variety of dog breeds. Just a few dog breeds in Europe in the 1500s has been bred into 250 different species, not species, but breeds of dogs in Europe alone. These breeds, or in the case of plants, cultivars, don't seem to be created by us. They're revealed by us as if that information for building those breeds and cultivars has actually been already extant, already in those dogs and plants and so on before humans started breeding them. Thus, breeding suggests there really are hidden designs in organisms, designs of species and breeds and so on, which is what intrabarometric diversification also suggests. Also, when we consider the development of organisms from single cells to as they grow up to adults, we see many organisms that actually develop into forms as they're growing up that look very different from the adults. In order to, for example, develop a frog, there must be information in frogs on producing tadpoles that then develop into frogs. In the information of butterflies, there must be information hidden in butterflies on how to make caterpillars to then develop into butterflies. So we seem to have evidence in development, in how organisms develop, that suggests that there are hidden designs in organisms as well. Rapid and recent diversification based upon hidden designs would in fact explain a number of other things we observe in the present world. They include, first of all, interspecific hybrids. These would be hybrids that are produced by taking two different organisms from different species. So it's inter or between species hybridization. So we might take a lion and a tiger, two different species, cross them and see if we can get a hybrid out of it. And we do. We can get a tigon or a liger, and that would be an interspecific hybrid, a hybrid between two species. What we find in the present world is that for many of the created kinds, probably somewhere around the taxonomic family level, we find many species within created kinds that can successfully be bred to produce hybrids. We can look at the anatids, the ducks, swans, and geese, for example, and there's 149 species of ducks, swans, and geese in the world, and 85% of the species can be crossed with other species to produce viable offspring. Another example is the camel family. We've got 5 species of camels in the world, 2 species of actual camels, and 3 species of llamas in South America. All of these are grouped into the camel family, and they're all the species we know of in the camel family. Well, we've crossed the camels, the Bactrian and the dromedary camels, to produce a hybrid between those two species. We've crossed the llamas and vicuñas to create an alpaca. By the way, if you're familiar with a llama in North America and the United States, it's usually an alpaca, and an alpaca is an interspecific hybrid between a vicuña and a llama of South America. We've crossed the guanacos with the llamas and guanacos with the alpacas and the guanacos with the vicuñas very readily. And in 1998, a dromedary camel was actually crossed with a guanaco. A camel was crossed with a llama to produce a 𝘊𝘬𝘢. 𝘊𝘬𝘢. And this is 𝘊𝘬𝘢, a picture of 𝘊𝘬 the 𝘊𝘬, a cross of dromedary and a guanaco born in January of 1998. This indicates that all the members of this camel family can produce viable offspring by hybridization. For two organisms to be able to hybridize suggests that they are probably very closely related. In fact, they're probably descendant from a common ancestor not very long ago. They haven't yet lost the ability to interbreed and produce viable offspring. It would seem that if they lived for a very long period of time, separate from each other and kept changing with respect to one another, that they would quickly get to a point where they could no longer interbreed. So the fact that we have interspecific hybrids and the fact that there are very many of them, they're very common, suggests that maybe within created kinds, all the species that we find within a given created kind has very recently come from or descendant from a single pair of organisms coming off the ark. Another thing that seems consistent with rapid and recent intrabarometric diversification are genetic throwbacks. These are the occasional individuals that are born in a population that have traits of a species of the past that the current species is descendant from. So, give an example to help understand this. Occasionally, every once in a while, very rarely, but every once in a while, a horse is born that actually has multiple toes. It might have, that rather than have a single toe, they actually have three toes that go down almost to the ground. At least two of the three almost go down to the ground. It's kind of a funny thing. Most people probably don't know this about a horse, but if you look at the legs of a horse, the part that bends there about halfway in between the body of the horse and the ground is not an elbow, in the case of the front legs, or the knee, in the case of the back legs. The elbow of the horse is up here in the main part of the body. The knee of the horse is up here in the main part of the body. That's what bends to produce those features. What this bending part in the middle of the leg between the body and the ground is actually, in the front leg, it's the wrist, and in the back leg, it's the ankle. And everything from that point down is a single toe. Horses are walking on a single toe on the front and the back. And that's usually the case. But every once in a while, a horse is born that actually has three toes on each of their feet. Two of the three come almost all the way down to the ground. That is sort of a leftover remnant, apparently, of what horses came from. We have in the fossil record horses with multiple toes, not with a single toe, but actually walking on three or even four toes in the past. So modern horses are descendant from horses with multiple toes, and every once in a while, a modern horse is born with this characteristic of its ancestor. When that happens, that's called a genetic throwback. That makes sense if intrabarometric diversification has been rapid and recent. If horses have only recently been derived from this multi-toed horse, then it's easy to see how genetic information could still exist in modern horses for making multiple toes. Note also that when you have hidden information like this, hidden information in modern horses to make multiple toes, that information is easily destroyed by mutation. Mutation will take out hidden information, and we don't know how to clean that mutation stuff out if it's hidden. If it's in the part of the DNA that's expressed that is not hidden, well, the mutations can be maybe deleterious to the individual. The individual isn't able to produce offspring, so it doesn't pass its mutations on. So sometimes you can get mutations out of an organism if, in fact, they are tied to particular traits that are disadvantageous to the organism. But if you had hidden information and a mutation occurs in it, you never see the mutation, you will never be able to take out the mutation. You just save the mutations and accumulate them over time. And it should be then that mutations will destroy hidden information in time. In fact, since the probability of a mutation is about 1 out of a million, in a million generations, you would expect to have had a mutation at every single nucleotide in the DNA. In a million generations, you should lose all hidden information altogether. Shouldn't have anything left. So that suggests that horses came from, modern horses with one toe on each foot, in fact came from horses with multiple toes certainly less than a million generations ago. Since they have offspring after a couple of years or so, after a few million years, there should be nothing left of hidden information of multiple toes. So modern horses are descendant from horses with multiple toes something less than millions of years ago, consistent with the idea that they in fact are descendant from a single common ancestor at the time of the flood, only about 4,500 years ago. A second, or actually third category of evidence consistent with interbariumenic diversification being fast and recent are vestigial organs. A vestigial organ is an organ that appears in all members of a particular species. Genetic throwbacks only occur every once in a while in individuals. Vestigial organs are similar, but in this case, it occurs in every member of a particular species. But this is evidence of something that was inherited from an ancestor that's still hanging around, that doesn't have as much function or any function in the present. Examples include such things as, well, in the modern horses, although the modern horse usually has a single toe that it's standing on, there's actually the leftover remnants or vestiges of two other toes, splints on either side of the main toe, that are still left over from the time when horses were descendant, actually had 3 or 4 toes each. Also in modern whales, the baleen whales, for example, have these bones that aren't connected to the vertebral column, but in fact are very small bones reminiscent of the pelvis and leg bones, indicating that, or suggesting that whales in fact are descendant from animals with legs and with hips. And in fact, if you go into the fossil record and go back in time, you find that there is in fact a whale with legs and hips that seems to be the ancestor of modern whales. And since the information for building hips and legs is basically hidden, in fact, in some whales, it doesn't show up at all except in certain stages of development and then disappears, doesn't seem to have a function, then we know that not much time has elapsed since modern whales came from whales with legs. That's consistent with the idea that interbariumenic diversification has occurred very quickly and recently. Again, it's lost by mutation over time if it isn't very recently derived. A fourth set of evidences for rapid and recent intrabarumenic diversification are what are called stratomorphic trajectories. Here, we have a representation of horse fossils through time. We're going to represent the different shapes or forms that a horse can have on, again, a piece of paper. So that if you have two different dots on this, each dot corresponding with some form of horse, a dot of a horse here versus one over here means that they're very different from one another. Two dots that are really similar, close to each other, mean that you're referring to horses that are very, very similar. What we have here is a representation of where horses would lie on such a diagram that we find in the fossil record. The oldest fossils in the fossil record are found down here in the blue. As we get more and more recent fossils, we move up into the green, and then the blue, and then finally the most recent fossils that are living, or fossils and living species, are in that little yellow dot up here. So it looks like horses changed from this position on our what we call morphology space. They changed through time, moved through morphology space, split into two different groups with different forms, and finally ended up in the current position that horses are. When we have this kind of situation, where the oldest rocks have horses of one form, and as you get younger and younger rocks, the horses gradually change upward towards the modern form, we have a trajectory of morphology, of shape, of form, that actually moves through time. And so this seems to indicate that all these horses are in fact descendant from probably one of these horses way back here in the oldest rocks we have horses from. And this is consistent with the idea that horses very quickly change through time, if in fact this represents the period since the flood, which we in fact do believe is the case. Another category of evidence that's consistent with rapid and recent intrabarometric diversification are various evidences of speciation. Speciation would be any event that creates two species out of one species changing into another species, or one species splitting, part of its population staying the same, another part of the population becoming something different. Evidences that speciation has occurred in the past, it would be consistent with the idea that in fact new species have come about. One of the evidences of speciation that in fact Charles Darwin used to argue that species do in fact change is that if you take any given species on this planet and look on this planet for the most similar species to it, it's usually that the most similar species are next to each other or close to each other living on the Earth. They're living in adjacent areas. That suggests that the two species probably came from a common ancestor that lived in that particular area. A second evidence of speciation is that if you look at modern species, and any given modern species, and then look in the fossil record for the species that's most similar to it, you will usually find that the most similar species lives in the same area, or lived in the same area. Classic example is the armadillo, which is found in South America and up into North America. When you look at the fossil record for the organism that looks most similar to it, you find the 𝘋𝘦𝘷𝘰𝘵 is the most similar fossil to the modern armadillo, and lo and behold, the 𝘋�តុ𝘷 is in fact found as fossils in South America. So it appears as if 𝘋�តុ𝘷 really did change into the modern armadillo, and that's consistent with the idea that intrabarometric diversification has occurred. The last example I'm going to give of speciation are what we call ring species. These are situations where we have a string of species, actually a ring of species, around a zone where that species can't live, such as this example all the way over here, where we have some gull species that live around, and we're looking at the Earth from above, from the Arctic Sea. They're living around the Arctic. They can't live in the Arctic, that's too cold for them, so they can only live in populations around the Arctic. But what's interesting about these populations is if you look at adjacent populations, adjacent species, they can interbreed with each other quite readily. Those species on each side can interbreed with the next species. Those species can interbreed with the next species. But all the way over here, you got two species that really do not cross with each other to produce viable offspring. What looks like has happened is you started with this species a single species up here in this position, and they came to this barrier where they couldn't go. They couldn't go onto the Arctic ice. So part of the population went to the east, part of the population went to the west. And as they went, the populations changed. They changed independently on either side, so that by the time the populations came together again on the other side, they could no longer interbreed. They had changed too much to allow themselves to interbreed on that side. This suggests that these two populations at the end, even though it might be clear that they are very similar populations, they cannot interbreed. Yet since they can interbreed with all these populations going all the way back, it is possible for genetic information to actually pass from one to the other by going all the way around the circle. And that means that they, in one sense, they look like one species. But if all these individuals, all these populations disappeared and you had only these two species, you would be convinced that they are separate species because they cannot interbreed. That is a ring species. Another example would be salamanders around the desert of central California. The salamanders at one end of the desert, on either side, the salamanders can't live in the desert, but on the hills around the desert, they can interbreed. The next group can interbreed with the adjacent populations, the next one with adjacent populations. But alas, the two salamanders at the southern end of the valley cannot interbreed. It looks like salamanders came into the area from the north. The population split. As the population made its way on either side of the desert, the two populations changed to the extent that by the time they came back together again, they could no longer interbreed, demonstrating that new species can arise and have arisen very recently. All of these things are consistent with the idea that after the flood, intrabarometric diversification was rapid and recent, that species came about very quickly to repopulate the earth with the high species diversity that God wanted people to see in the post-flood world.